Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have for you 4 truly disturbing stories. And as you might have guessed by now, these stories are creepypasta style. But don't jump ship, they are really good, and in fact are probably the last I'll do this year, or at least for a long time in any case. And we'll be back with more true stories tomorrow. I would also like to give a huge thank you to Channel X, who has joined us for this video. Be sure to check him out when you're done here, link in the description and at the end of the video. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. Human head for sale, condition used. Best ad I'd seen on Craigslist all day. I'd spent the last hour surfing the site for a passive-aggressive gift for my ex-girlfriend's wedding. Was this a possible candidate for gag gift of the year? Well, I certainly thought so. I didn't think it was a real one for a second when I texted the user. I just told him what I wanted it for and asked if he had any left. It didn't even have a look that real. Just enough for a little jump scare and a good laugh. Here's the reply I got a few minutes later in all caps. Plenty left. Do you care whose? Screw the fact that he's shipping heads, there's nothing that labels someone crazy like typing in all caps. But hey, let's be fair here, considering I was the one asking about buying. Maybe I didn't have a right to condemn his eccentricities. I replied and told him I didn't care, just as long as it wasn't someone I know. I mean, come on, he's got a sense of humor, right? Who do you know? I'll check. Again, in all caps, was the reply I got. I asked for a picture and told him I would let him know if I recognized them. I didn't hear back after that and figured the joke had run its course. Just as well, really. Maybe it was petty to try and sabotage the happiest day of her life. Then again, she did sabotage my entire life when she decided to wait until I'd finished paying off her college loans to tell me that she was seeing someone else. It wasn't until that evening when I got the next reply. She will love this one, nice and fat. He doesn't need it anymore. I almost choked on the pizza I was eating. Fat was a generous description of the picture he sent. Bloated would have been more accurate, like it had been sitting out in the sun for a long time. Congealed blood still clung to the base, where several inches of spinal cord extended past the tattered flesh of the neck. The nose was gone, replaced with an explosion of a sticky cartilage where a massive force like a shovel had plummeted it in. I've had a few hours to contemplate my life choices, and now that I was staring at the picture while trying to eat, I knew this was a bad idea. Sorry, not interested, I replied, after blocking the number. The next morning I woke up to 3 more pictures sent from a different phone, each one with a macabre description. This little lady was a fighter. She's a little more knocked around. My only old man. Those blotches on the skin were there before. If you want mint condition, check out this lady. Poisoned, not a mark on her. There are some things you just have to ask even if you don't want to know the answer. Stuff like, do you love him? And how long will dad be gone for this time? Where are you getting all these heads from is another one of those questions. I typed it in, simultaneously eager and afraid of the reply. I only need the bodies, was the answer. I seriously considered reporting this creep to the police, but again, figured it was nothing more than a bad joke that I didn't want to waste more time on. I told him not to contact me again and blocked his number too. A week later, I arrived at the wedding empty-handed without a date. My ex-girlfriend gave me a tight smile and a half-assed hug, which is usually reserved for people with a severe skin condition. She said it was nice of me to be here and thanked me for the present. Present? What present? She told me someone dropped it off with my name on it. I found it sitting on the table in the reception room, a little brown box about the size of a bowling ball with a flare of red string tied up in a dainty bow. A note was slipped underneath which read, "You seem to have trouble deciding. Here's a free demo to try out. If you aren't 100% satisfied, you can exchange it when you're done. So many questions came to my mind, like how he found me, or what exactly one does to try out a head. When I lifted the box up to grab it, I couldn't help but notice the dark, sticky stains soaking through the bottom and onto the table. I couldn't exactly leave it there. What was I thinking? It had my name on it and everything. Most of the people were still arriving and talking outside, so I grabbed it and made for the door. There was a return address after the demo period had expired, so at least I could get rid of it. I scuttled across the dance room, trying my best to wipe up any errant drips which were soaking through the bottom. I almost made it to the door when I spotted my ex, quickly turned around, racing for the back door instead. More people were flooding in now, including her family and many of her friends who knew me. None of them could have guessed what I was carrying though, so as long as I could make it to the door, or at least I could have if the back door wasn't wired to the fire alarm. The blaring sound shook me so much I almost dropped the box. It started to open, and I caught a glimpse of the bloody pulp inside. It half flopped out of the box as it tumbled. I had to scramble to keep it closed, and from the shards of splintered bone to the puddle of dried blood around the base, I had no doubt it was real. By the time I looked up, the whole room was staring at me. There was only one thing louder than the alarm after that. My ex's mother screaming, "He's trying to steal the presents!" My panic-stricken brain didn't want people to think I was a thief, so I just dropped the box. If I had been able to think even a little more clearly, I would have realized it was much worse for them to think I was a murderer, but I couldn't deal with that accusing siren and all those disapproving eyes. I dropped it and ran, swearing to myself that it wouldn't matter as long as I never saw any of those people again for the rest of my life. I did get some messages though. The next day, my ex told me that my present was a big hit. Everyone loved the gag. They thought the head was a symbolic gesture, which meant her past romances were dead, and I was so sweet for giving my blessing like that. I guess no one looked close enough to decide whether it was real. It's the other message that bothered me more though. All caps sent to remind me that your free trial is up. You can pay $10,000 to keep the head, or send one back if you're finished. Now where the hell am I gonna get another head?
I was 5 coffees down and still shattered as I sat in the diner off Route 1 past midnight. The waitress did her best to keep my cup filled. If she knew I wasn't going to tip, I don't think she'd have been so attentive. I finished my pastrami on rye and waited patiently for my ice cream. It was my little treat to myself for being on the home stretch. My hands shook from the caffeine, but my head still hung heavy with the fog of impending sleep. I needed to stay awake for 2 more hours. That's all I needed. Then I'd be home, in my own bed. The diner was modestly full for that time of night. The low murmurs of conversation did nothing to cover the sound of the bell as it rang, signaling another patron. I barely noticed the man in the black hoodie glide past and sit in the booth opposite. His jiggling leg caught my attention. "Psst," he whispered to me over the walkway. On edge, I returned a scowl. "What?" "Want to know something interesting?" he said in a Russian accent. I immediately thought he was going to try and sell me drugs. "Stop bothering me," I said, returning my gaze to the screen on my phone. He ignored me and leaned over anyway. "The waitress is going to drop that coffee pot in 10 seconds. I peered up to see her pouring the coffee into another customer's cup. I couldn't have said it was curiosity. More like when someone says, "Don't think of a pink elephant." You kind of have to. Still, I found myself counting down in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nothing. I turned to face the man, finding it hard to suppress my smirk. Then, I heard the smash. My smile fell. Don't beat yourself up. Very few people actually know how long a second really is. Intrigued, I got up and shuffled to the seat opposite him. What the heck was that? I asked. Just a lucky guess. Bull. So, what else are you going to do? Levitate? Chop someone in half? I want to play a game with you, he said. I wondered what a man like him was doing in a place like this, in the middle of nowhere. Without thinking, I searched around, trying to find a hidden camera, expecting to find myself on YouTube in the morning. Brian, he continued. That is your name, right? It was, but everyone called me Sonny. Long story. I nodded. In a couple of minutes, a woman in a red dress will run into the diner screaming. We will hear the distress. Everyone will look around. And she will burst through those doors. He grabbed my hand. Are you listening to me? He said in an almost panicked tone, his Russian accent now authoritarian and unnerving. Yes, I said. She's going to say there is a dead body in the parking lot. And you know what, Brian? They are going to think it was you. Why? He held a finger up, signaling for silence. 3 seconds, and the phone is going to ring. We sat in silence for those 3 seconds. The pregnant pause that held in the air made the atmosphere grow thick. Can you get that? I heard the waitress say. I'm still cleaning up this mess. My eyes widened. The man opposite me smiled. What is déjà vu? He asked. It's when you feel that you know that something was going to happen, and then it happens. Exactly. Hang on a minute. Are you saying you had déjà vu when the waitress dropped the coffee pot? Yeah. But déjà vu is a feeling you get after it's happened, not before. The human brain is incredible. It is constantly calculating what is going to happen in the future. And sometimes your brain works out something incredibly unlikely. You are unaware of it until it happens. I've learned how to harness that. Bull, I said, almost spraying the man in spit. I turned as I heard a commotion from outside. He leaned forward. We have less than a minute for you to make your decision. My heart began to race in my chest. The fog of tiredness had now been replaced by panic. All my concentration was now focused on this stranger in front of me. Brian, you ran someone over in the car park. I tried to recall, but all I could remember was coasting in off the highway and into the parking lot. I had the music up so loud and was so tired that it was possible. He was a homeless man. He tried to flag you down, but you didn't see. You just ran straight over him and parked up. There's CCTV here. You'll go to prison. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. My leg now jiggled. The man's was still. There was a large crash as the front door to the diner swung open. The bell rang out loud, as if it were as panicked as I was. A woman stood there. Her red dress barely covered her knees. It was just like the man said. There's someone in the parking lot. I think they're dead, she screamed, her voice shrill, cracking on the odd syllable. Somebody call 911. Brian. I ignored the man, I was in shock. I watched the waitress panic, rushing over to the phone that hung on the wall. "Brian," the man shouted, pulling my hand toward him. "You need to get those CCTV tapes. It's the only way you'll get out of this." "I don't know if I can do that. What about my truck?" "Give me the keys. I'll drive it up to the next rest stop. When the dust settles, you meet me there." I saw blue lights in the distance. I had no idea if they were on the way here, but I couldn't take the risk. I pulled the keys out of my pocket and gripped them hard. "I'll distract the staff. It'll give you time to get into the back office and take the tape. Make sure you put another tape back in. When you do, leave out the back door, take that tape, and throw it into the bushes. I'll come and collect it later." "Why are you helping me?" I asked. "Deja vu," he said. "You are going to help me not very long from now. I need to make sure that happens." I gave him the keys. He got up and calmly walked over to the waitress, who was nervously swaying from side to side. The man, I assumed was the manager, talked to her. The man in the black hoodie walked past and struck up a conversation. The employees turned their backs to allow me to make my move. I'd never done so much as stolen a pen, never mind obstruct justice. But I knew what I needed to do. It was easy to enter the office. There was a small table with a laptop and a monitor hung from the ceiling in the far corner. On it displayed 4 different security cameras. There was no VCR to be seen. I followed the cable into a metal cabinet. I opened it up. A few LED lights flashed. There was no tape recorder. Who knew where this sent its feed? It could have gone straight to the cloud for all I knew. I needed to destroy it, just in case. I looked around the room for something I could use. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I heard from behind me. I said. "I was looking for a weapon just in case whoever did that was still here." "Get out," he said, pushing back into the diner. I saw blue lights rotate and shine on the diner's walls. I was screwed. I sat back down at my booth and contemplated what would happen. I'd run someone over. I was too tired to drive. Once they knew that, they'd know why I was in the back office. Is this what the guy meant by deja vu? If it was a little late for me. When I saw the cop enter, the bell barely rung. It was as if I had tunnel vision. The walls were closing in. I was going to spend a long time in prison. In that moment, I was okay with that. Deja vu? If it was, at least it was helping me cope. The woman in red was nowhere to be seen. I guess she was outside with the police, telling them how she found the body. The hoodie man I was speaking to was gone. At least he got away. I knew where to tell the company the truck was. I really hoped he wouldn't get in trouble for taking it away from the crime scene. He did everything to help me, and he was a complete stranger. How did he not see that coming? The police radio crackled into action. I didn't take in the garbled sounds as my mind tried to come to terms with what I was to tell my wife. Oh, Jesus, my wife. I never even thought of her. My heart sunk. "Copy that," the cop said, and left the diner. I waited for 30 minutes for the cop to return. He never did. "More coffee?" the waitress said. "It's on the house, you know, for all the unpleasantness we just went through." She filled my coffee cup. "What do you mean?" I asked in a daze. She put her hands on her hips and in a delicate southern accent said, False alarm. Seems that dead body was just a homeless guy dead drunk. I don't understand. The cops took him away. I thought he was dead. So did that poor lady. She looked more relieved than any of us. A nice man offered her a lift in his big truck. The pennies fell into place slowly but surely. Can I ask you something? Sure, hun. Why did you drop your coffee pot? I didn't, she said, leaning over to whisper. The man that was sitting there hit it out of my hand. But I can't blame them. They wouldn't tip me if I did. The seat was empty. I should have seen it coming. He stole my truck. Miss? I asked. Yes. I counted out the money I owed for my meal. Can you call me a cab? I left the diner to wait. I thought about it a moment and returned to leave a tip. She wouldn't have expected that. Thank you, she said. I forgot your ice cream. Don't worry about that. No, I insist, she said, and disappeared into the kitchen. A couple of minutes later, she returned. Here you go. The bowl was full of vanilla ice cream covered in raspberry syrup. I dug in. Take your time, sweetie. Just heard on the radio there's a pileup on the freeway. A semi-truck broke through the central reservation and burst into flames. It'll be a while before that's cleared. Can I refill your coffee? Please. I smiled. I phoned my wife to tell her I'd be late. I dialed my manager. He was angry, asking why I was phoning so late. You'll not believe what's just happened, I said. I explained that my truck had been stolen. He paused for a moment, then asked, Have you ever had déjà vu? I was 4 coffees down and still shattered as I sat in the diner off Route 1 past midnight. The waitress did her best to keep my cup filled. If she knew I was going to tip as much as I do, I think she'd have been more attentive. I finished my pastrami on rye and waited patiently for my ice cream. It was my little treat to myself for being on the home stretch. My hands shook from the caffeine, but my head still hung heavy with the fog of impending sleep. I needed to stay awake for 2 more hours. That's all I needed. Then I'd be home, in my own bed. Something didn't feel right. I wasn't sure what. It felt overly familiar. Except I've never stopped here before. The diner was quite full for that time of night. The low murmurs of conversation did nothing to cover the sound of the bell as it rang, another patron entering from the cold. I barely noticed the man in the black hoodie glide past and sit in the booth opposite. His jiggling leg caught my attention. Psst, he whispered to me over the walkway. On edge, I returned a scowl. What? Want to know something interesting? He said in a Russian accent. I was intrigued. I didn't know if it was his oddly 90s apparel or his Eastern European inflection. I returned my gaze to the screen on my phone, ignoring him. He leaned over. The waitress is going to drop that coffee pot in 10 seconds. I peered up to see her pouring the coffee into another customer's cup. I admit, I was curious. Strangely, I believed him. I found myself counting down in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Then I heard the smash. See? He said. I don't know why, but I expected him to smile. I got up and shuffled to the seat opposite him. "Do I know you?" I asked. "Maybe," he replied. A look of concentration or concern drew on his face. "So what else are you going to do? Chop someone in half? Levitate?" He was about to talk when I interrupted him. "You want to play a game with me," I said. My own words caught me off guard. I wondered what a man like him was doing in a place like this, in the middle of nowhere. I searched around looking for someone, a woman I thought it was. Why did I expect to see a woman? There were women in here, but none of them were who I had in mind. "Brian," he continued. "That is your name, right?" "Sonny," I replied. "Everyone calls me Sonny. Only my parents call me Brian." "In a couple of minutes," he started, "a woman in a red dress will run into the diner screaming." He grabbed my hand. "Oh my God," he said in an almost panicked tone, his Russian accent now authoritarian and unnerving. "She is going to say there is a dead body in the parking lot," I continued, perplexed. He held a finger up, signaling for silence. 3 seconds and the phone is going to ring," I said. The look of concentration turned to elation. We sat in silence for those 3 seconds. The pregnant pause that held in the air made the atmosphere weigh heavy. "Can you get that?" I heard the waitress say. "I'm still cleaning up this mess." My eyes widened. The man opposite me clapped his hands once before checking around the diner, scolding himself. "You know what déjà vu is, right?" he asked. "It's when you feel that you know that something was going to happen and then it happens." "Exactly." "Hang on a minute. Is that what's going on now?" "Yeah. But déjà vu is a feeling you get after it's happened, not before." The human brain is incredible. It is constantly calculating what is going to happen in the future, and sometimes your brain works out something incredibly unlikely. You are unaware of it until it happens. I've learned how to harness that. "Bull," I said, almost spraying the man in spit. I turned as I heard a commotion from outside. He leaned forward. "You know what's about to happen, don't you?" I nodded and felt my truck keys in my pocket. My heart began to race in my chest. The fog of tiredness had now been replaced by panic. All my concentration was now focused on this stranger in front of me. Has this happened before? Has, hasn't, going to, not going to. It's up to you, Sonny. It's imperative you follow the visions as closely as possible. If you don't, we will drift too far off course, and this whole thing will be in vain. The woman, she saw someone who appears dead in the car park. You need to believe you did it." I tried to recall, but all I could remember was coasting in off the highway and into the parking lot. I had the music up so loud and was so tired that it was possible. "He's a homeless man. He tried to flag you down, but you didn't see. You just ran straight over him and parked up. There's CCTV here. You'll need to believe you'll go to prison." "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked. My leg now jiggled. The man's was still. There was a large crash as the front door to the diner swung open. The bell rang out loud, as if it were as panicked as I was. A woman stood there. Her red dress barely covered her knees. It was just like I said. "There's someone in the parking lot. I think they're dead," she screamed. Her voice shrill, cracking on the odd syllable. "Somebody call 911. "Sonny." I ignored the man. I was in shock. I watched the waitress panic, rushing over to the phone that hung on the wall. "Sonny," the man shouted, pulling my hand toward him. "You need to go in the back office and pretend you are looking for those CCTV tapes. Trust me." "I don't know if I can do that. What about my truck?" "Give me the keys. I'll drive it to the next rest stop. When the dust settles, you meet me there." I saw blue lights in the distance. I had no idea if they were on the way here, but I couldn't take the risk. I pulled the keys out of my pocket and gripped them hard. "I'll distract the staff. It'll give you time to get into the back office and pretend to look for the tape." I had a vision of monitors, a laptop, but no VCR. They don't have tapes here. It's all on the cloud. "How the heck do I know that?" I said. "Deja vu," he replied. "You are going to help me not very long from now. I need to make sure that happens." I gave him the keys. He got up and calmly walked over to the waitress, who was nervously swaying from side to side. The man, I assumed was the manager, talked to her. The man in the black hoodie walked past and struck up a conversation. The employees turned their backs to allow me to make my move. I'd never done so much as stolen a pen, never mind mess with the fabric of time. I stood for a long while. It was as if I was grounded to the spot. The air grew thick. A shimmer-like heat haze gradually appeared. The outlines of the people in the diner grew blurry. It was as if they split into multiple different versions of themselves. What was I seeing? The Russian glared back at me. At the same time, he turned and walked further away. There were two of him. It was as if I was seeing different possible timelines, as crazy as that sounds. I knew what I needed to do. It was easy to enter the office. There was a small table with a laptop and a monitor hung from the ceiling in the far corner. On it displayed 4 different security cameras. As expected, there was no VCR to be seen. I followed the cable into a metal cabinet. I opened it up. A few LED lights flashed. There was no tape recorder. I knew the door was going to open, so I waited and braced to be shouted at. "What the hell are you doing in here?" I heard from behind me. I said. "I was looking for a weapon, just in case whoever did that was still here." "Get out," he said, pushing me back into the diner. I saw blue lights rotate and shine on the diner's walls. What the heck was going on? I sat back down at my booth and contemplated. Did I actually run someone over? Had that Russian guy tricked me? I was too tired to drive. Once they knew that, they'd know why I was in the back office. Was this really deja vu? If it was, I had no idea what I'd gotten myself into. Something clicked. It felt like an electrical buzz down my spine. A police officer was going to walk through the front door. Moments later, when the cop entered, the bell barely rung. It was as if I had tunnel vision. The walls were closing in. Everything was so clear to me then. I knew the woman in red was gone. I knew the Russian was gone. I presumed he had my truck. My truck. My muscles spasmed in unison. It's how I'd imagine being abducted by aliens. I felt the heat, my skin being scorched by a raging fire. I was on my side. The cars on the other side of the freeway slowed to a halt. I tried to scream, but the sounds were lost within the music that played too loud. I breathed heavily as the vision faded, the hot flames replaced by the modest warmth of the diner. What did I just experience? Sweat poured off of me. The ghost of the odor of burning plastic hung in the air. "Are you okay, sir?" the cop asked me with concern. Before I could answer, the police radio crackled into action. I didn't take in the garbled sounds as my mind tried to come to terms with what happened only moments before. "Copy that," the cop said, and left the diner. I knew I needed to wait. It felt right. I scanned the room looking for that shimmer to reappear, to tell me if I was drifting off the correct path. It did not. "More coffee?" the waitress said. "It's on the house, you know, for all the unpleasantness we just went through." She filled my coffee cup. "Thank you," I said in a daze. She put her hands on her hips, and in a delicate southern accent, said, "Looks like that was a false alarm. Seems that dead body was just a homeless guy dead drunk. The cops took him away," she continued. "That poor lady. She looked more relieved than any of us. A nice man offered her a lift in his big truck." The pennies fell into place, slowly but surely. Was it a setup after all? "Can I ask you something?" "Sure, Helen." "Why did you drop your coffee pot?" "I didn't," she said, leaning over to whisper. "The man that was sitting there hit it out of my hand. But I can't blame them. They wouldn't tip me if I did." The seat was empty. I should have seen it coming. He stole my truck. But what about the visions? How did he do that? Hypnosis? "Miss?" I asked. "Yes." I counted out the money I owed for my meal and a large tip. "Can you call me a cab? The name's Sunny." "Sure." "Why, thank you," she said, eyeing the $15 I had left her. "I forgot your ice cream. Don't worry about that." "No, I insist," she said, and disappeared into the kitchen. A couple of minutes later, she returned. "Here you go." The bowl was full of vanilla ice cream covered in raspberry syrup. I dug in. "Take your time, sweetie. I just heard on the radio there's a pileup on the freeway. A semi-truck broke through the central reservation and burst into flames. It'll be a while before that's cleared. Can I refill your coffee?" A vision of me lying on my side burning to death flashed before my eyes, but this time with no heat and no smell. I took my time with the ice cream. I knew I'd be waiting a while. 23 minutes, in fact. "Your cab's here," the waitress said. I saw the lights of the car that idled outside. "April Drive?" he said, as I jumped into the back seat. "Actually, no." I thought about it. "Do you know the rest stop on Route 1? Which direction?" "If we were headed to April Drive." "Sir, the expressway is closed in that direction. Major pileup. I think there may have been some casualties from what I've heard over the radio." "Crap," I exclaimed. "Although, I do know a service route that could take us up there. You'd need to walk a while. Could you do that?" "Sure." I sat in silence as we drove out of the diner and under the freeway. The plumes of smoke and the flickering of the inferno could be seen from miles around. I wondered if this was pointless. That Russian guy surely perished. The road twisted and turned. Trees loomed down oppressively in the dark. I waited for another vision, another bolt of electricity to run down my spine, but nothing happened. I had no clue about what the future now held. The driver put on his high beams. You see that fence over there? He pointed through the gloom. Yeah. Hop that, and it will only be a few 100 yards. How do you know about this place? I asked. I've dropped off many a sex worker here. Really? Yep, they pay well too. I wondered if that was a hint. I took it as such, and when I left, gave him an extra $10. It cleared me out. Guess you don't get paid as well as them. You want me to wait? No, I said, not thinking of what I'd do if the Russian wasn't there. See you around, Brian. Wait a minute. Before I could ask, he had already closed the window, his taillights disappearing around the corner. I vaulted the fence, the wood rotten and sodden from the rain earlier in the day. Mulch squelched under my feet as I jogged to the floodlit building in front of me. I panted when I stopped, my haggard breath turning to vapor in the cool night air. The parking lot was quite busy. The semi-truck spaces were almost full. I assumed they'd heard about the crash on their CBs and decided to pull off and wait here instead of in traffic. The freeway was jammed. Cars and vans sat bumper to bumper, their headlights illuminating the vehicles in front, like little dioramas of stick figures, all looking straight ahead patiently for the car beyond to move. 5 minutes of waiting in the cold made me angry. A light wind ran through my thin coat, chilling me to the bone. Another 5 minutes and I felt embarrassed and stupid. I had no money. I had my phone, but who could I get out here to pick me up? I was about to phone and wake my wife when I saw 2 people walk along the slip road that led to the rest stop. One of them waved. I turned around, looking for who they were waving at. It was me. Cautiously, I waved back. They broke into a jog. The floodlights illuminated them. 2 people. 1 man, 1 woman. The man wearing a black hoodie, now soaked through. A woman, her red dress barely covered her knees. I knew you'd make it, the man said, his Russian accent thick and full of excitement. This is Natasha. Pleased to meet you, she said, her American accent now gone and similar to the man's. I'm Chekhov. Sorry I didn't introduce myself earlier. I see a lot of potentials. What the hell is going on? I demanded. You have the gift, he said, holding his arms outstretched. Had, you mean? I know jack about what's coming next. That's fine. It's your first time. Actually second, but we'll come to that later. We need your help. Why me? Do you really need to ask this? Isn't there anyone else who can help you? Yes, there is. 30 before tonight. You make it 31. I don't understand. Something big is going to happen. The Farseers have told us. We need more of you. We need to prevent what's coming. What? You won't believe me if I told you. Can I get you a coffee? I'll tell you a little about what we're doing. You'll want to be a part of it. I've seen it. He grinned. Come on. He gestured to the small cafe that sat proud from the main block. I was tired, but I was also very curious. Sure, I said, yawning. Haven't you forgotten to do something? The Russian asked. Your wife? Oh, Sarah. I phoned her to tell her I'd be late. I dialed my manager. He was mad, asking why I was phoning so late. You'll not believe what's just happened, I said. I explained that my truck had been stolen. He paused for a moment, then asked, Have you ever had deja vu?
It's hard to imagine what it's like to lose someone you love before it happens. Of course, I've seen it hundreds of times in the movies, dramatic affairs for the most part, with lots of screaming and crying and carrying on. The shock, the disbelief, the unconstrained rage, all lashing out at the world for the most ordinary and predictable thing in it. It wasn't like that after Dad disappeared, though. He was simply there one day and gone the next, leaving nothing but a penetrating dull ache. Weeks of police investigation turned up nothing. It wasn't an act of cruelty which made the world steal him away. It was merely universal indifference. His life was short, his death random and meaningless, and there was nothing left but the rest of us to do than carry on. I got the phone call from Mum late at night at my studio apartment. Dad was presumed dead, and the police had officially closed their investigation. I stayed quiet and listened to her all the way through, even though there was nothing left to say. I thanked her politely for letting me know, and then I hung up. After that, I stared at the wall for about an hour, not really thinking, just observing idle thoughts as they passed in one side and out the other. I live in a different state, and hadn't even seen him in a few months. Eventually I decided that waking up tomorrow wasn't going to be any different than every other day when he was still puttering around the kitchen table 1,000 miles away. But I was wrong. I'd lived alone for years, but my apartment had never felt so empty. I had to keep the TV on all the time, just so that I wouldn't have to hear the soft gurgle of blood in my veins or listen to the dull monotony of my own breath. I don't know how I ever noticed those sounds before, but they were starting to drive me mad. I guess I couldn't stop thinking about how fragile my own life was, my mortality, and how pointless life would have been if I were to end it all. That's why I got a dog, half husky, half coyote, about 6 months old. I picked her up from the animal shelter, where some cowboy was dropping her off. The dogs were growling and snarling at him, but she calmed down the instant he left. I figured she must have been abused or something, but she seemed so sweet to everyone else that I decided to take her home with me. A few days later, I got a call that Dad wasn't dead. About a month after he disappeared, he just showed up again. Mum said he just walked in one day, sat down at the breakfast table like nothing had happened. She couldn't get a word out of him about where he'd been, but she was just so happy to have him back she didn't even press. He wouldn't tell me anything either, just grunted about needing to clear his head. It seemed like a miracle to me too, but I guess I had already spent so much time fixating on death that nothing much changed for me. I kept the dog anyway, called her Snoots, and from the very first time I called her that, her ears pressed flat with excitement as she started wagging up a storm. She was really skittish at first, but hated being alone, and would follow me from room to room, even sitting between my legs when I sat on the toilet. Snoots was absolutely perfect for me. Her constant attention made me feel like I mattered again. Maybe my life didn't matter in an existential sort of way, and maybe my death wouldn't mean anything on a cosmic scale, but it would mean the world to her. I was warned it might be hard to train her because of the coyote blood, but she learned everything almost immediately. She was so shy that she'd try to walk between my legs when a stranger was near, but it felt good, knowing that she trusted me. She did have one bad habit though, unpredictably going off. The first time was a few months after I got her. We were walking down the sidewalk towards the park, when her fur started to bristle and her mouth flared to reveal powerful teeth. Before I knew what was happening, she was snarling and barking and howling at the lady on the other side of the street. The lady started running, and Snoots actually lunged at the leash, almost dragging me into the street after her. As soon as the lady was gone, Snoots was back to normal. I couldn't figure out what happened. She'd never ever growled at another animal before. The lady didn't have a dog with her, and she wasn't carrying food or anything. She hadn't made the least threatening move. It was so random that I forgot about it. But that wasn't the first time. Next it happened. She jumped up from the couch and started snarling at the door. A few seconds later, someone knocked, but she howled in answer. I looked through the peephole, but it was only the pizza guy. I had to drag Snoots into the bathroom and lock her in there until he left before she could calm down. That behavior happened so rarely that I couldn't figure out how to predict or prevent it. I couldn't just keep her isolated, and it was pointless to take her to training when she was usually the sweetest thing in the world. I was terrified that she would randomly attack someone and would be taken away from me though. So I kept her daytime walks short after that, only going out early in the morning or late at night when there weren't so many people round. Another few months went by, and I thought her feral side had finally been tamed when it happened again. It was after 9 p.m. and we were doing a last walk through the park before it closed. I was talking to Mum and Dad on the phone and wasn't really paying attention to Snoots snuffling along behind. My first warning was when the leash snapped violently, ripping the phone from my hand. I automatically dove to catch my phone. Snoots was dragging me so hard she managed to break the leash free from my grasp. I couldn't stop her from charging headlong into the darkness. A guttural snarl rising in her throat, I chased after her, shouting her name, screaming a warning for whoever was out there. By the time I caught up, Snoots was already on top of someone. She had his hand in her mouth, savagely thrashing back and forth like she was trying to rip it off. The guy was trying to push her back, but Snoots kept lunging at him whenever she lost her grip. By the time I caught up with them, she had her teeth around his neck, ferociously shaking like wild animals do when they're looking for a quick kill. I got hold of the leash and pulled so hard Snoots practically did a backflip. The guy was on his feet now, swaying uneasily. I started to apologize, but the words died in my mouth. His hand was a bloody pulp, severed digits scattered on the ground. The wound on his neck was even more brutal. A whole sheet of skin was peeled back, hanging in ragged tatters along his shoulders. Parts of his spine had ruptured straight through the side where it had been unmistakably broken. Exposed sinew glistened with blood as he slowly worked his neck in a long circle like some luxurious stretching after a long nap. I don't even know how he was still conscious. I wanted to go back for my phone to call for help, but it took all my strength to just keep Snoots from diving back to finish her prey. The man started fumbling at the ruined tatters of his neck, not taking his eyes off me. I braced myself, half expecting him to attack us right back in retaliation. He was too focused on his own injuries though. I was trapped in a place holding Snoots back, helpless to turn away from what happened next. He grabbed the hanging folds of his skin with his good hand and started to peel it down the remainder of his neck. When he reached around his back, he started to peel it there too, the whole mess of flesh flopping away like a diver getting out of a wetsuit. I watched transfixed but mortified as he slid out the rest of his skin and clothing to leave them in a soggy pile at his feet. It wasn't exactly muscle, it was more like a second skin, pale grey and slick with blood, but it was fitted so closely to the structures beneath it that it mirrored the muscle striations and fibers. I didn't have that long to stare though. He was running as soon as he was free, leaving behind the whole wet mess he shed on the ground. I ran home with Snoots as fast as I could. I didn't even go back for the discarded phone. I kept telling myself it wasn't real until I got back to my apartment, but it was harder to lie to myself while washing the blood off Snoots' fur and face. She was wagging again, looking like her old self until she opened her mouth to let the last severed finger drop on the floor. I couldn't be alone after that. Even Snoots wasn't enough company. I talked with Mum for a long time to help calm down. Although I didn't breathe a word about what happened, she sensed that I was rattled though, and she convinced me to come back home and visit for a while. I kept Snoots with me, more afraid of the thing that discarded its skin than how she reacted to it. I have her locked in the car with me, where I'm writing this now though. I want to run in and hug Mum and tell her how good it is to see her again. I want to ask Dad about what happened, why he left, and why he decided to come back. I can't get out of the car though. I can't let Snoots out. not with her snarling since the moment I pulled into Mum's driveway. There was only one thing that worked Snoots up like that, and I couldn't lie to myself and say it was something else. The only conclusion I could draw was that my dad may have really disappeared, but whatever came back was only pretending to be him. I left Snoots in the car and knocked on the door. I let out a long breath of relief when Mum opened it. Then a hand fell on her shoulder. The thing that looked like my dad popped into the window. It made me sick to imagine the bloody, slick grey skin underneath that intimate mask. It was one thing to lose my father, but have to look at him again was this unbearable. They invited me in and I sat down, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. The disguise was seamless, his affection genuine. Both of them avoided any mention of his disappearance, and I didn't bring it up either. I had to find some way of breaking the illusion, though. I couldn't very well just leave Snooks and him to mangle in the living room. I had to bide my time and wait until I could get him alone. I got my chance later that evening. Snoots was out back in the yard, still agitated and restless from her proximity to the creature. Mum was out at the store picking up things for dinner, and I invited Dad out to the yard to toss a football around like we used to. I figured we could take him by surprise and get rid of him before Mum got back. She'd just think he'd disappeared again, and if she could accept it once, then hopefully she could accept it again. It was better than letting that thing live inside the house watching her sleep, just waiting to make its move. I had one of his hunting knives gripped in my hand and I waited outside the door. I couldn't wait until Snoots started snarling, or he might realize he was caught and got away. I had to strike hard and fast, and then Snoots could join me and help finish the job. I tried not to think of the thing wearing my father's sweater as anything but a monster. I tried to tell myself that the thing had killed and replaced my real father, anything to make it easier to do the deed before the opportunity was lost. And then the door opened, he stepped out. Not noticing me pressed against the side of the house, I grabbed him from behind, not wanting to see his face. I plunged it into his side, not wanting to let him speak. He pitched forward and I let go. I still couldn't look at him, so I ran to the yard and opened the gate. "Now's your chance," I shouted at Snoots. But she wasn't moving. Her fur was calm. She ran up to lick me and started wagging. I had to drag her out to the yard, thrusting her towards the creature crawling on the ground. Snoots looked back at me, unsure of what to do. I almost thought I had gone crazy, until at last the fur started to bristle down her back. She bared her fangs, hunching down in preparation for the pounce. It wasn't until then that I noticed the sound of tires on the gravel driveway on the other side of the house. Snoots wasn't paying attention to my father at all. It was my mother she sensed. Snoots was sprinting around the side of the house and I ran to keep up with her. Mum was just starting to get out the car with the armful of groceries when the dog sprang. She managed to get the door closed in time, but Snoots wasn't giving up. She beat herself against the window, snarling and slamming herself over and over in the car. Mum was in reverse now, tearing back out the driveway, out the street to disappear around the block. I called an ambulance, but Dad didn't look like he was going to last. Snoots came to lick his face, but the blood wouldn't stop, and I didn't know what to do. He said he didn't blame me, but every word was getting weaker than the last. I asked him why he left, but I could have already guessed the answer. He'd run when he found out Mum had been replaced by one of the skinwalkers. "Then why'd you come back?" I had to ask. I needed some closure before he was gone for good this time. "Because I still loved her," he told me, "and that thing is the closest thing there is to having her back again."
My inaugural trip to a haunted attraction as a boy was to a farm-themed hay maze, with all the scarecrows and old barns and cheap animatronic crows with red eyes that you might expect. At the end of it, a theater kid dressed as a hillbilly farmer would chase you to the exit with a cap shotgun. "Get out of here, you dang kids," he'd say in an Appalachian drawl that was hysterically overdone. "I'm coming for you. Y'all better run." The place was cheap, low budget, and entirely ridiculous, and I fell in love with it all the same. So, a year later, we visited another place. Miss Wretched's House of Horrors, it was called, I think, down on Gartersdale. And that was an equally cheesy haunted mansion with pop-out skeletons and suits of armor that dropped their rubber axes near your feet, which would trigger an off and off-time clang sound from poorly hidden speakers. I loved that experience too. So, at my insistence, we got fake IDs the year after that. And with those, gained admittance to the big kid haunt that was all the rage at the time. It was called Dark House. I remember the blood-red vampiric font above the door quite clearly. And it was my first run-in with professional actors, and dirty words, and pitch-black halls and chainsaws. Upon completion, 15-year-old me felt like he'd become a man. But as the years wore on, attractions like these lost their edge. And I tried to up the ante a bit. Truly I did. I went out of town on road trips to all of the spookiest places in the state, and beyond, as soon as I was old enough. Among the locales checked off in this period were various real haunted houses in which nothing happened. Several of those win a prize if you last the night spooks in which I won simply by falling asleep, and 2 of those infamous adult haunted houses in Vegas, where you have to sign a waiver and be okay with extensive, but not really extensive, physical contact. Those were effective, to be sure. But after my second visit to one of those places, even those lost their merit in my eyes. I was starving for a legitimate scare by age 27. And that's when, on a deep web forum for like-minded adrenaline junkies, I first heard about an attraction known as Labyrinth. It was mentioned almost passively by another user, and when I pressed them for further information, the response was frustratingly vague. Can't tell too much, they'd said. They contact you if you want in. Whatever. In my experience, there was rarely ever a payoff frightening enough to justify that type of gimmicky cloak and dagger nonsense. I closed the forum and forgot about it entirely by the end of the week. And then came the black envelope. Inside that was a black letter, appropriately enough. And typed tastefully on its inner sleeve, it said the word Labyrinth. And beneath this, it provided an address and a date and time. Given its name, I'd expected Labyrinth to be a maze of sorts, or one of those escape rooms with a horror bent. But instead, I found myself staring up at a palatial, chateau-esque estate of impossible size, with spires and towers and wings and various other gratuitous additions to structure. It was truly magnificent. I'd visited North Carolina's Biltmore once, and that estate wasn't any more impressive than the one before me. On the door to the place was a second black letter that read simply, Labyrinth. Find the heart to escape. And despite my initial jaded skepticism, I now found myself quite intrigued. In the context of the location, I now found these vague letters more tasteful and reserved than gimmicky. So it was with a strange optimism that I entered the place and shut the door behind me. It locked on its own with a faint click. There was no mechanism on its interior to unfasten it from what I could see. The interior of the place was every inch as magnificently constructed and furnished as the outside would suggest. It was regal and immaculately clean. And it was empty. "Hello?" I said. An echo responded. I waited a bit before I spoke again. "I'm Andrew Owens. Got a letter in the mail yesterday. Said to come here today at 3. So, here I am." Nothing. I checked my phone for the time, and it agreed with my punctuality. I guess this is the game? I thought back to the letter. "Find the heart to escape," it had said. It was short. It was vague. It was open to interpretation. And I mused on its possible meanings and reasoned that I had to somehow prove my courage, my heart, to be allowed out. The isolation was a fresh twist, and so was that creeping thought that if something goes wrong, there's nobody here to help. It made me a bit afraid, and I loved it. I decided to explore. In no particular order of my visiting them, the mansion had on its first floor, and in the immediate vicinity of its parlor, a coat room, a sitting room that featured both 2 separate fireplaces and multiple redundant couch and table furniture sets, a grand study with a gorgeous multi-$1,000 mahogany desk by the window, and more books in its floor-to-ceiling shelves than all but the largest public libraries and every single private collection I'd ever heard of, a billiard room, a grand banquet hall with filled wine goblets at every seat of its table, a kitchen behind that with a fresh bowl of fruit on the counter, and a gallery in which various regal painted portraits of young and beautiful people were hung, who I assumed to be either the owners of the estate or relatives of those owners, although I didn't stop to see if there were informative plaques. A centerpiece portrait of a woman in a blue dress was particularly striking. Striking, but not frightening. Not that I wasn't particularly appreciative of it. I'd come here for a thrill, had I not? But the magnificence of this place aside, I wasn't sure what made it a fearful experience and not just an elaborate puzzle. But I got my answer shortly enough. I moved from the billiard room to the coat room, and from the coat room to a long hallway that was, like the others, fit with cushioned benches on the sides of it, and Persian rugs, and a grand player piano that provided a pleasant enough tune, and the only sound aside from my own footsteps. Then I opened the door at the end of the hallway and found myself, bizarrely enough, back in the billiard room. I stopped cold. Now, I hadn't taken so much as a single turn since I'd arrived at the building, much less in the quick minutes since the last time I'd been in that room. But here I was all the same. The first thought I had was, okay, so that's the twist then. They built identical rooms to create an illusion of going in circles. But that theory was frustrated by the fact that everything matched. Everything. From the pattern of the balls on the tables, to the order of the cues in the rack, to the way the chalk was placed on the windowsill, and the stain it had left there. I then reasoned that it's an architectural trick, I think. The halls are curved ever so slightly to give the impression of being straight, when in reality, they're turning you every which way and circling you back around to other rooms. Hence the name, Labyrinth. I was impressed. Truly, genuinely impressed. Not scared, really, but I'd been tricked and surprised. And even a seasoned critic like myself had to admit that the twist was indeed effective. Maybe this place isn't such a dud after all. So, I moved through the room and opened the door at the far end that led back into the hallway. And I walked straight into that old study I'd been in 15 minutes and 6 rooms earlier. My heartbeat skipped a step, and for the first time, I was unable to muster up any explanation at all to explain this phenomenon. No amount of subtle hallway twisting could account for this. I decided at least to test the extent of the trick. While still standing in the billiard room, I shut the door and opened it again to find not the study, but a new hallway instead. When I shut it a third time, I opened it to find a bedroom, and after the fourth such attempt, I was staring into the kitchen. More revelations followed. That place, while otherwise identical to its former self, was beginning to decay. I slid my finger across the surface of a kitchen counter and rubbed it against my thumb. Dust sprinkled onto my trousers. Dust, and not a negligible amount of it, in a room I'd noted earlier for its immaculate cleanliness. I felt that old dread mounting up, and this time I was powerless to swallow it. And the door there led me not into the banquet hall, but into the sitting room again. And like the kitchen before it, it was dirtier than it was before. Not filthy, but it was certainly lived in. A crooked picture frame, a pillow on the floor, cup rings on the table. The blanket that had been neatly folded on the couch the first time I'd been here was now crumpled up against the arm of the seat. It was then, though, that I got an idea. Leave the door open behind me to keep open an avenue of escape. The rooms can't change if the doors are open, right? So, I left it hanging halfway and moved to the door at the other end of the living room. But I stopped when I reached it. What awaited me wasn't the billiard room, or the kitchen, or the gallery, or the bedroom, but the sitting room again. The very same room in which I stood, even filthier now. And standing in the door at the far end was myself again, leaning halfway through the threshold in what was a perfect mirror of exactly my stance and exactly my demeanor. I turned around behind me then, and sure enough, I could see myself there, too, looking back into another version of what was no doubt the same room from the door I'd just come through. Hello? I and a chorus of me's said at the same time. I slammed the door in a panic when that happened, and threw into action my second plan. A forced breakout through the window at the end of the room. I picked up the chair and let out a shouted, "I am done with this place." Then I hurled the chair at full strength into the glass. It bounced off without so much as scratching it and tumbled onto its side. I turned around to lift it up again for a second toss, but I stopped before I did. Sitting propped up on its two ends, on the surface of the table and clean amidst all the dust, was a third black letter. "No cheating," it read. "Find the heart to escape." I blinked. I felt sick. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, and I backed up. And then, after a brief pause, I began to run through door after door. I went to find the parlor, but it was a fruitless effort. The billiard room led to the banquet hall, to the coat room, to the portrait gallery, to the bedroom, and each chamber entered featured more disorder and more ruin and more decay than the ones before. The wood had rotted, the light bulbs were dead, there were cobwebs and spiders in the corners. But not once did the parlor present itself, and after the third pass through the study, I collapsed by the leg of the desk to catch my breath. But it was then, in a bizarre stroke of luck, that I looked to the other end of the room and saw that one of the grand bookshelves had snapped under the weight of age and collapsed, spilling its books to the ground and crushing a corpse. It was old, I realized when I inspected the body up close, it looked like the thing had laid there for decades by the time I found it. Long enough for the smell to wash away and for the clothes to rot off. But in its hand was what appeared to be a dust-covered book of sorts, or a tome, or a collection of notes. I picked it up and flipped it open, and I began to read. And after some searching, I found the following relevant passage. Found the pattern to the rooms. Took me forever, but I found it. Just gotta make sure to run to the door when I'm done. Beneath that, there was a scribbled diagram of sorts, where a task in a certain room would lead to another. Light fireplace and living room, kitchen. Eat from the fruit bowl, pool room. Pocket the 8-ball, coat room. Find the key in the pocket of the right coat, banquet hall. Drink from the chalice, portrait gallery. Make it through, study. Spin the globe to match, and the notes ceased at that precise moment. I can only imagine it was then that the shelf fell. Perhaps purposefully by some mechanism, or perhaps because of sheer age and the absence of maintenance, and crushed the author. How long they'd laid here I couldn't tell, and at the moment, shamefully, I didn't quite care. I was simply worried about avoiding the same fate myself. So, I crept around the study and to the desk. And while I did, the floor creaked and it moaned and it protested with each and every step. But I made it, luckily. And when I did, I placed my hand on the globe and spun it once without purpose. Match the globe to the what? I searched for a bit before I saw an old 18th century cartographer's map, yellowed and weathered and worn like the globe, and ripped a bit on the far edges of it, at the far end of the room and above another shelf. I looked back down at the globe and nudged it left until both it and the map depicted the new world in the middle. I guess that's good enough? And just then, something hit my head, whack, and tumbled to the floor. I looked at the ground to find a book there. And then I looked up just in time for another book to fly from the other listing shelf and hit me in the forehead, whack. Then came another book, and another, and another. It quickly became impractical to dodge them all. I simply put my hands over my head and made for the exit. And as I did, the trickle of falling books became a stream, and that stream became a waterfall, and that waterfall became an avalanche that consumed the room utterly. From every shelf of every standing case in the room, books flew off the shelves, and they began to pool on the ground before filling it up and flooding it. And the torrent rose like the ocean tide. And I climbed over the piling mountain of the stuff and was battered hideously as I did. My vision swam. My ribs cracked. I had the wind knocked out of me no fewer than 3 times. And by the time I reached the far end of the room nearest the exit, a tidal wave of books and encyclopedias and tomes and leather-bound and hardback collections had reached its crest and began to crash down in my direction with a tremendous and simply earth-shattering crash. I dodged left and to the door, and seconds before I was consumed, I threw it open and tumbled unceremoniously into the next room, and kicked it shut with a slamming click. And when I did, oddly, not a sound could be heard from the other side. No falling books or settling shelves or breaking things. It was as if all that'd been there in the first place was nothing at all. I gave myself a once-over and a quick pat-down to make sure. Nothing broken or bruised, mercifully enough, and I allowed myself to rest and breathe. "Holy," I said. "Holy. Okay. Okay, I'm okay. I'm here. I made it." After a moment more of rest and regrouping, I looked around the sitting room I'd already been in multiple times, and I remembered the instructions from the notes. Light the fireplace in the living room. Okay, easy enough, right? Just need matches and wood or something. I looked around the room and found old newspapers and kindling already in the floor of the fireplace. Above the mantel were matches. I took the last one from the box and swept it across the edge, and it produced for me a small flame. I tossed it into the pit, but before I could even begin to make for the kitchen, that flame caught and roared with stunning speed. Then, a moment later, there was another swoosh. I whirled around and found the other fireplace in the room had been ignited too. And before I could process this development, its flames spread just as quickly and just as menacingly as the ones from the first. And they leapt out of the gate and caught on the ratty old carpet and began to climb. The chimneys in this dilapidated place had been so choked with soot, too, that the smoke spread right out into the living room and began to fill it up. I hit the ground when I noticed this, and I began to crawl. But the fire was far, far faster than I was. Within a minute, it had consumed the couch closest to the door. Then it reached the table, and that old untreated wood went up all at once and cracked and crumbled and fell to ash. And I soon felt those flames licking at my legs and bearing down on my back. And I gave up any effort to crawl and stood up and began to run. I leapt over the second couch and the table there, just as the ceiling cracked and tumbled in behind me. But when I reached the other furniture set, the flames from the second fireplace that had already eaten it all up caught on my trousers and climbed up the rest of me too. I was engulfed in fire in seconds flat. And all my screaming and all my thrashing produced nothing for me then. Soon, my hair was singed off, and my clothes burned away, and my skin itself began to bubble and boil and char and melt. It was excruciating to an indescribable degree, but I knew there'd be water in the kitchen, so with the last of my strength, I stumbled to the door and opened and entered it and shut it behind me. And I stopped. And I patted myself down for the second time. I could breathe, I realized. I could breathe, and I had hair. And I was utterly and completely untouched by fire. Even my clothes were only as unkempt as they normally were. I leaned up against the door and closed my eyes and regrouped again. I opened my eyes. I was in the kitchen, as expected, and sure enough, it was as filthy and dilapidated as the rooms before it, if not considerably more so. The lights had long since snuffed out, and the wood was old, and it was molded and rotted through, and the various hanging pots and all the appliances throughout were lopsided and broken. And then I saw my objective on the counter. Eat from the fruit bowl, pool room. And no longer was that bowl filled with fresh produce either. Instead, its contents were little more than molded, thoroughly rotted mush. A cloud of flies buzzed above and around it. I said aloud, "Nope, no way." But I knew, even as I spoke, I had no other way to escape. I approached the bowl and squeezed my eyes shut tight and reached into it, past the swarming, feasting insects. And I grabbed what felt like it had once been an apple. Then I breathed in and out several times and told myself, it's temporary, like the fire. And I held my nose, and I ate the thing and chewed it faster than I could taste, and swallowed it whole. To say the fruit was simply expired would be a profound understatement. It was filthy, and so putrid and so thoroughly rancid that at least half of it stuck to my teeth and required me to lick it off, or pull it out with my bare hands. I heaved, I retched. I nearly threw up, but stopped myself before I did, unsure if doing so would void my accomplishment and require me to start the game over, or eat more fruit from the bowl, or feast on my own vomit. So I swallowed the stuff and ran to the door and slammed it shut behind me. Fortunately, Labyrinth was merciful enough to purge that taste too. But the memory remained, and once I was confident, the contents of that stuff were out of my stomach. I released what wasn't yet, and vomited onto the floor in a series of splats. Not like it did much for the decor of the place one way or the other. The billiard room was, like the others before it, of course, profoundly decayed. The ceiling here had caved in almost entirely, and the pool table on which I had to pocket the 8-ball, if memory served, was old and feltless. And while it had a stick on it though, there were no billiard balls at all. Under my breath, I mumbled, "Oh, for God's sake," as the parameters of the upcoming search began to dawn on me. But then I heard something in the far corner of the room that sounded like something wet. A slurping, maybe, or a sucking or a licking. I turned to look, and there were the balls at least, at the feet of an enormous, likely rabid, mange-ridden mastiff that had been feasting on them in the absence of proper food. Fortunately, the thing was fastened to the desk in the back. But how much yield the chain had, I was unsure. It saw me a second later, and when it did, it stood up and stared, and for a long moment, we did little else but eye each other up and down and sideways. I harbored few illusions about its intentions, with all its bared teeth and its aggressive stance, and those ropes of spit hanging from its jowls. Before making a move, I ran through a series of plans that would ideally get me in possession of the 8-ball without having to wrestle it out of the thing's paws. Among the rejected ideas were one in which I used a pool cue to at the very least beat the dog unconscious from a distance before making for the ball, and one in which I tried somehow to distract it. Eventually, though, I decided to use a cue not to mess with the mastiff at all, but to try to roll the ball away from it. Any direction I could get them to move would be a victory, I reasoned. So, after tossing the dog a piece of wood to bite on, I knelt down and began to poke at the pile of slobber-covered billiard pieces. They scattered, but I was so focused at tapping the 8 on its head and nudging it toward me that I didn't pay enough attention to the dog at all. It had ignored the wood, it turned out, and it lunged for my cue and grabbed it in its jaws and tossed it, and me with it, into the wall. Whump. I tumbled back onto the floor, and before I could regroup, that snarling, barking hound was bearing down on me with full speed and monstrous, demonic aggression. Its chain kept it from my neck at the very least, but after a panicked struggle, it managed to clamp down onto my ankle and drag me, with me howling and grasping for ground and digging into the wooden floorboards with my nails to no avail, back to its corner. Two things happened that worked in my favor then. First, our wrestling sent the billiard pieces across the floor, the 8-ball with them. And second, I managed to flip around and crack the beast in the jaw with my good foot before it got me back far enough to deliver a mortal strike. I broke free after that and limped over to the 8-ball and placed it on the table and fetched a fresh cue from the wall. I lined up the shot. Come on, baby. Come on, come on, come on. And knocked it in. Yes! But a half-second later, the dog broke free of its chain and bounded over in my direction. I had an Olympic second to react. I flipped the table over to startle the mastiff and made a mad dash for the exit while it made a mad dash for me. But it reached me first, unfortunately, and it snarled and snapped, and I held it by the throat an inch from mine. Its breath stunk like the end of the world, like rendered flesh and bone and disease and rot. I gagged and pushed and scrambled back toward the door, and it pounced again and knocked me back down and began biting my bad leg for a second time. I screamed and I flailed, and my hand found a pool cue that snapped under the toppled table. I grabbed it and jammed it into the dog's mouth and scrambled free while it yelped and pawed at its wound. I didn't wait around to see how or if it released the wood. I simply limped into the coat room and slammed the door shut. The pain subsided. 3 rooms left. 3 rooms left. 3 rooms left. I opened my eyes after a bit and gave myself another pat down for good measure. I was intact. The corpse in the study indicated that these hazards weren't mere illusions, but things did at least appear to reset themselves whenever a door was closed, assuming the player was on the far side of it. I looked around the coat room. A single naked bulb flickered in the center of the ceiling and provided just enough light to illuminate the coats, but not the floor. I didn't pay much mind to that, though, once I remembered the instructions for proceeding. Find the key in the pocket of the right coat. Naturally, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of coats hanging in that place. Leather and tweed, and business attire and windbreakers and dusters and countless other varieties. I started with the closest one. Nothing in that pocket but lint. The same thing awaited me in the pockets of the next 4 coats, too. But it wasn't until the 5th that I understood it wasn't lint at all. Ow! The heck? I yanked my hand out of a pocket and found there a red welt, ringed and with a puncture wound in the center of it. I blinked. Then I turned back to the coat and took it off its hanger and held it upside down until the contents of its pockets were emptied. I heard no clang indicative of a key hitting the floor, but even in the poor lighting, I could see the spider hit the ground and scurry off into the shadows. I looked at my hand. It'd begun to swell and fester. In little more than 10 seconds had passed since I'd been bitten. From that point forward, I opted to empty out the coats rather than reach into the pockets. And without fail, each and every one of them held at least 1 and as many as 4 spiders per pocket. By the 20th coat, there was a constant skittering around me as the horde swept across the floor. To and fro and this way and that, and over my boots and up my legs. Still no sign of the key. And by then, I was losing my nerve. Ow! Mother! I grabbed at my forearm and winced, and found there another bite. The culprit had fled before I could return the favor. On my hand, the initial wound had swelled to the point that the whole limb felt heavy, and on my legs and ankles were a multitude more such incisions. Whatever species of arachnid this was, they carried extremely potent venom in their fangs, and quick-acting stuff to boot. I became sluggish after a dozen or so bites, and then I began to lose control of my muscles. I tripped over my feet, and my breathing slowed, and by the time I found the key in the right side pocket of the 41st coat I'd checked, I counted them as I went. I could hardly see straight at all. I caught the thing, but I collapsed no sooner than I did. And then came the horde, from the shadows behind me and in front of me, and on both sides and above me, the spiders swarmed. Adrenaline alone gave me the strength to get back up to my feet, but even that was a challenge beyond anything I'd encountered thus far. My body was covered in welts and stinging bites from head to toe. There were spiders on my hands. There were spiders in my shoes. There were spiders in my clothes, too, all throughout, and on my neck and on my face. Each and every one of the things was biting and feasting as I lumbered clumsily to the door. Each step felt like a mile, and by the time I thumbed my right hand onto the knob and managed, after excruciating effort, to insert the key, miraculously I never once dropped it. Doing so would undoubtedly be a death sentence. The things were in my ears, and in my nose, and in my mouth. I tried to grit my teeth, but so inflamed were all the facial muscles required for that task that I was unable to stop the things from pouring into the opening and down my throat. I couldn't even gag. All I could do was throw every last inch of strength left in my bones to the task of turning the knob and pulling open the door with wrists so beaten and so red and so swollen that doing so felt like shattering bones. And when it was open, I then had to take steps with feet so enlarged that my shoes themselves felt ready to burst. The light from the next room, what little of it there was, spilled into the coat room and illuminated the bones of at least a dozen other souls who'd never made it. I slammed the door shut behind me and collapsed, and I gasped for air. As had always been the case, the wounds reset themselves, and I was in good health. Not a single spider crawled on my skin or through my ears or underneath my clothes. But, like with the rancid fruit, the memory remained. I screamed, "What is this place? Huh?" There was no answer to that, of course. So in my rage, I walked up to the banquet hall table and grabbed the closest chair and tossed the thing with all my strength across the surface. Plates and cups flew to the ground and broke there in 1,000 pieces among all the other debris. The chair I'd thrown simply tumbled across the length of the table and stopped at last, near the other end of it. A goblet stood fast at the far side, untouched and unweathered. Drink from the chalice? Portrait gallery. I didn't move for some time. I simply stared at the thing, and felt it was doing the same to me, not unlike the dog, and I was unable to keep my mind from running wild through the possibilities of what it might contain. Rancid milk, I thought. Or a cup of insects, maybe. Or fresh blood. And at that point, I was so thoroughly exhausted and disheartened that the mere thought of drinking such vile content brought me to tears. But I put one foot in front of the other anyway, and marched over to it. And although it was likely ill-advised, I peered inside. It looked like wine, I saw. So I smelled it, and it smelled like wine. Then I picked up the goblet and swished the drink around a bit, and saw it had the same consistency as wine too. I wiped my eyes and set my resolve and made sure to locate the exit behind me and to the left, and held my nose and drank the stuff. It tasted sweet. Not like any form of alcohol, as I'd expected, but sweet and thick and cool and refreshing. I downed the drink in its entirety. Then I wiped my mouth. And no sooner did I turn toward the exit and form the thought that was way too easy. What's the catch? Then I noticed that there were now, curiously enough, 2 exits. Not 2 exits in any concrete way, but with my vision swimming the way it was, I realized there were 2 of everything, really. 2 doors, 2 pairs of feet, 4 hands, 2 tables, 2 goblets. I thought, that's weird. And then I collapsed onto the ground and was all at once, and once again, utterly unable to coordinate my movement, and to think, and to make sense of sight, and to breathe. It was punishingly, achingly hard to breathe, in fact. Each breath I drew brought fire with it, and before long, the poison had swollen shut my throat until no air could pass through it at all. I tried to gasp for air, but couldn't. I tried to reach into my mouth and pry open the airway, but got nowhere in that endeavor either. I retched and convulsed, and seized and clawed at my throat, and made all the emotions of gasping desperately without receiving any air at all. The last coherent thought I had was that, as usual, salvation could be reached at the exit and nowhere else. So with my body in revolt, I commanded it up, and then I stumbled and wobbled and tilted and fell in the direction of that door, and picked myself up and fell again, but a bit closer this time, and with a knee full of splinters. Soon, it hurt to take in even what little light there was in that room, and every movement I made was agonized and cumbersome and burdened. But I'd come too far to give in now. Just as I began to black out, I reached the door and threw it open and fell through. Only when I slammed it shut could I breathe again. "Haven't broken me yet," I said. I coughed violently. Not yet. The portrait gallery awaited me now. Make it through. By now, I'd purged myself of illusions that any room in this demented place would be easy to solve. And the more vague the instructions, the more difficult they'd be to follow. So, I looked around for potential hazards and saw none. There were no spiders, there were no dogs, there were no fires, and there were no poisons or falling books either. There wasn't even proper darkness in that place. It was as old and as broken as any room before it, but a hole in the ceiling allowed the moonlight to pour in and bathe it. And in that light, all there was before me was a hallway lined with aged portraits. So I began to walk forward, slowly and deliberately, and with every hair on my neck and arms standing straight on up. At first, there truly was nothing to fear. But then, I turned my attention to the paintings themselves, and I realized that they appeared to be aging. When I stopped, so too did that process. But if I moved so much as an inch toward the end of the room, which itself was shrouded in darkness so thoroughly at the bottom I couldn't see any door at all, then the figures would age. It wasn't profound or rapid, really. Just little things here and there. A new wrinkle would appear, or their clothes would lose just a bit of their luster. The only one I could see for the entirety of my walk, though, was that mighty centerpiece ahead of the woman in blue. She aged a year a step as I walked. When I entered the room, she was young and youthful and vibrant, with the sun at her back and a sparkling dress that matched the sky. But halfway through the room, even that sky had grown gray. Her hair was nearly white, her smile had fallen to a more tired countenance, and her dress was old and wrinkled and worn and faded. She looked terribly, terribly sad, and all at once, I got the impression that I was killing her myself, that every step I took brought her closer to death. I paused for a breather after that, and for a time, we stared at each other as I rested. I almost wished I could tell her how sorry I was. I took another aching step forward. Almost there, I told myself. Almost out. My hips stung. My breathing was heavy, yet again, although for entirely different reasons, and I'd begun to sweat. I rubbed my hand across my forehead and my smooth scalp, and did my best to pace my... Why is my scalp smooth? I patted the top of my head with both hands. Nothing up there but skin. Then I looked at my hands. They had aged profoundly in just the few minutes since I'd entered the place. Wrinkled and veiny and liver-spotted and simply old. And all at once, I was overwhelmed with dread and fear and anger and confusion. I looked back, but knew there was nothing for me there. I could only go forward, but each step brought more pain and more anguish. My joints ached. My eyes became tired. I looked back up to the portrait at the 3/4 mark and saw the woman there was now in her 80s or 90s, at the door of death and without even the resolve to frown. I pressed forward and looked down and saw my clothes too had begun to weather and age. I now wore rags and barely that. It was an exponential falling apart. In the beginning of the room, each step aged me a month. Then a month became 2 months, and that became 3. By the middle of the place, I aged a year for each step, and now, every footfall brought with it a decade or more. Soon, I could no longer stand at all, but merely crawl. My elbows shook and they wobbled, and at last, still a mere 2 or 3 running strides from where I imagined the door to be, it was still too dark to make out what waited in these shadows, but an eternity away in my condition, I collapsed. There was nothing left. I looked up one final time at the painting. All the flesh was gone. Only bones and dirt remained. And then, I too was little more than bones. I'd never known true darkness until I passed in Labyrinth. There was nothing at all to see on the other side. Truly nothing. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, and there wasn't so much as a dull spark at all to give me a sense of direction or context. I was simply floating in empty, unconstructed space, and although time had no meaning here, I felt vaguely that I had been there for a very, very long amount of it. Weeks, perhaps, or months, or years, or decades. I was unsure. By the time the door presented itself to me, I'd long forgotten about Labyrinth, or even who or what I was. I simply opened it like it was the most natural thing in the world, and inside, I found a pillar of light that pulsed and beat to a steady rhythm, like a heart. And then it came back to me. Find the heart to escape. And with that, flooded in all the memories of that place. The changing rooms, the rapid decay, the books and the fire, and the rancid food and the dog, and aging to the door of death all at once. All of it. I willed myself forward and into the light, and I tumbled out onto the grass. Then I looked up and saw stars there, and I looked around and found myself in front of the mansion at twilight. I felt a quick pang of relief and hope, and instinctively repressed it until my pat-down was complete. Then I let it sing. I was alive. I was alive, and I was breathing, and I was young again and unharmed. And for the first time in hours or days, or however in God's name long it'd been, I felt free. I began to laugh and cry at the same time, and while I did, I ran away from that horrid place, and through and past the gate, and out to the field where my car was still parked. I made it home an hour or so later, and fell into a deep and restful sleep. Suffice to say, the wretched experience in Labyrinth completely and utterly cured me of my need to be thrilled by fear. And to you, I'll merely say this. If you ever get a black envelope in the mailbox, toss the thing, or better yet, burn it.
Hey guys, Mort here. Thank you so much for listening as always. I'd like to extend a huge thanks to Channel X for joining me in tonight's video. If you'd like to hear more of his silky, delicious voice, you can find it over on his channel, link on screen soon and in the description. As always, an extra thanks to my members and patrons whose names are on screen for your continued help and support. It is absolutely invaluable to me. It means the world that you help me keep the channel going. Thanks guys. But I'm going to leave you there with Channel X's link on screen now. So stay awesome, check him out, and I'll see you in the next one.